Remnant is one of the most abstract and unsettling concepts in Five Nights at Freddy because it is never explained like a scientific rule or a clean supernatural law. Instead, it exists in the space between technology and the soul, blurring the line between what is mechanical and what is human. Where the missing children's incident explains why the animatronics are haunted, Remnant attempts to explain how that haunting persists, spreads, and can even be manipulated. It is not simply ghost energy or a convenient plot device. It is the series' way of exploring the idea that suffering leaves residue, and that intense emotion, especially pain and fear, can bind a person to the physical world long after death. Remnant is the glue that traps consciousness inside metal, ensuring that nothing in Freddy Fazbear's history is ever allowed to fully disappear. At its most basic level, remnant is a substance formed when a human soul attaches itself to metal, particularly animatronic endoskeletons. This attachment does not happen peacefully or naturally. It is the result of violent death, emotional intensity, and proximity. Children murdered inside suits or near animatronic machinery do not simply die and move on. Their terror, confusion, and rage seep into the metal around them, infusing it with something that is neither fully physical nor fully spiritual. This is why animatronics in Five Nights at Freddy's behave less like possessed objects and more like fragmented people. They do not speak clearly, do not reason normally, and cannot recognize allies from enemies. Remnant preserves awareness without clarity, existence without freedom. It is survival stripped of dignity. What makes Remnant especially disturbing is that it can be harvested, transferred, and reused. Through William Afton's actions, Remnant becomes less a tragic byproduct and more a resource. He discovers that metal infused with suffering can prevent death, extend consciousness, and even animate new creations. This is where the series crosses fully into moral horror. Remnant is not evil on its own, it is the trapped essence of victims. The evil lies in recognizing that essence and choosing to exploit it. William's experiments turn murder into method, transforming children into fuel for immortality. The animatronics are no longer just haunted by accident, they are part of a system built to capture and recycle agony. Remnant also explains why destruction alone does not always free the spirits. Smashing an animatronic, burning a building, or dismantling a suit does not automatically release the soul if the remnant remains intact or is transferred elsewhere. This is why the series is filled with false endings and incomplete resolutions. Fire becomes important not because it is dramatic, but because intense heat is implied to neutralize remnant, breaking the bond between soul and metal. Even then, the release is not guaranteed. The persistence of remnant reflects the idea that trauma cannot simply be erased through force. It requires acknowledgement, intention, and finality. This is why so many attempts to clean up Freddy Fazbear's legacy fail. They destroy the surface while leaving the core untouched. On a symbolic level, remnant represents memory that refuses to fade. It is grief embedded into infrastructure, sorrow turned into circuitry. The animatronics do not attack because they are evil. They attack because they remember something they cannot articulate. Remnant keeps them stuck in a moment of betrayal, endlessly replaying the aftermath of violence without understanding its cause. This is why they are most active at night, when distractions are gone and the past has room to surface. The security office becomes a pressure point where remnant-driven beings collide with the living, creating fear not out of malice, but out of unresolved pain. Remnant also reframes the idea of immortality in Five Nights at Freddy's as something grotesque rather than desirable. William Afton's survival through Remnant is not triumphant, it is parasitic. His continued existence comes at the cost of countless trapped souls, and his body becomes increasingly unstable, decayed, and monstrous. The series makes it clear that remnant-based immortality is not true life, but prolonged decay. Consciousness without growth, existence without relief. In this way, Remnant acts as a punishment disguised as a reward. William gets what he wants, but only in the most hollow and agonizing form possible. By the time Five Nights at Freddy, Pizzeria Simulator attempts to end the cycle, Remnant has become the central problem that must be addressed. The goal is no longer just to stop William or shut down restaurants, but to gather and neutralize the remaining concentrations of trapped souls. The fire at the end is framed not as destruction, but as release, an attempt to finally sever the connection between metal and memory. Whether this succeeds completely is left deliberately ambiguous, reinforcing the idea that some remnants of trauma may linger no matter what. Closure in this universe is always partial. Ultimately, Remnant is Five Nights at Freddy's way of asking what happens when pain is ignored, exploited, and built into systems meant to entertain and profit. It is the physical manifestation of unresolved trauma, proving that suffering does not vanish just because time passes or buildings close. Remnant ensures that every act of violence leaves a stain that can be transferred, reused, and weaponized if someone is cruel enough to do so. In that sense, it is not just a supernatural substance, but a moral one. It exists because someone chose to turn human lives into components, and as long as that choice echoes through metal and memory, the nightmare is never truly over. Agony is one of the most important yet least cleanly defined forces in Five Nights at Freddy, and in many ways it sits beneath Remnant as the raw emotional engine that makes everything else possible. Where Remnant is the result, the binding of a soul to metal, agony is the cause, the emotional overload that stains the world strongly enough to refuse disappearance. Agony is not a substance you can easily measure or control. It is pain condensed into presence, suffering with momentum. The series treats agony as something that leaks out of people at moments of extreme trauma and embeds itself into places, objects, and even memories, creating hauntings that exist whether or not a full spirit is consciously involved. In this sense, agony is more primal than ghosts. It does not require identity, intention, or awareness. It only requires that something hurt badly enough. Unlike Remnant, which implies a degree of consciousness and persistence of the self, agony can exist without a complete soul attached to it. It is closer to an emotional echo than a person. This distinction is crucial because it explains why some animatronics and objects in the series behave violently or unnaturally, even when no specific child is clearly possessing them. Agony can animate without understanding, attack without hatred, and linger without purpose. It is pain stripped of narrative, acting out because it cannot resolve itself. This is why some entities feel more feral than vengeful. They are not seeking justice or recognition. They are reacting to an environment saturated with unresolved suffering. Agony is generated at moments of intense fear, betrayal, and physical harm, especially when those experiences are combined with isolation and helplessness. The murders associated with Freddy Fazbear are not quick or anonymous deaths. They are deeply personal violations that occur in spaces meant to feel safe. That contrast intensifies the emotional output, producing agony powerful enough to soak into the surroundings. Once embedded, agony does not fade naturally. It latches onto materials that endure, particularly metal and machinery, which is why animatronics become such effective vessels. They are not just physically present, they are symbolically aligned with the trauma, making them ideal anchors for emotional residue. Agony also explains why destruction alone often fails to cleanse a location. Tearing down a restaurant, scrapping animatronics, or even sealing rooms does not erase what happened there. The pain has already diffused into the environment. This is why new locations inherit old problems, why newly built animatronics become hostile despite updated designs, and why the franchise feels cursed rather than haunted by a single set of spirits. Agony spreads like contamination, not because it is supernatural in a traditional sense, but because trauma reproduces itself when left unacknowledged. The series repeatedly shows that trying to ignore the past only compresses agony until it erupts somewhere else. The relationship between Agony and William Afton is especially revealing. While William exploits Remnant for immortality, he is surrounded by agony of his own making. His creations are not only powered by stolen souls, but by the emotional fallout of his violence. Over time, this agony turns back on him, warping his environment and his fate. His existence as Springtrap is not sustained by control or mastery, but by being trapped inside a feedback loop of pain. He becomes a focal point for agony, absorbing it from every victim and every failure. In this way, agony functions as a moral force, ensuring that suffering cannot be externalized without consequence. The more pain William causes, the more hostile and unstable his world becomes. Agony also deepens the tragedy of the animatronics themselves. When they act aggressively, it is often not because they understand what they are doing, but because they are saturated with emotions they cannot process. They are not choosing violence, they are expressing it reflexively. This reframes the horror of the gameplay. The player is not being hunted by evil machines, but by pain that has lost its human context. The jump scares become moments where unresolved trauma collides with the living, brief, explosive interactions between past and present that neither side fully understands. In later interpretations of the series, lore, agony begins to resemble a kind of emotional gravity. It pulls events toward repetition, forcing similar tragedies to occur again and again. Restaurants reopen, murders repeat, and guards die because the emotional conditions that allowed the first incident to happen were never corrected. Agony keeps the story stuck, dragging everything back toward the same outcomes. This is why the series feels cyclical rather than linear. Progress is an illusion when the emotional core remains poisoned. Ultimately, Agony is Five Nights at Freddy's most unsettling idea because it suggests that pain has permanence. It challenges the comforting notion that time heals all wounds, replacing it with the idea that ignored trauma becomes infrastructure. Agony does not scream or announce itself. It hums quietly inside walls, circuits, and routines until it is triggered. Remnant may trap souls, but Agony traps situations. ensuring that the conditions for horror can be recreated long after the original victims are gone. In that sense, Agony is the true antagonist of the series, not a character or a monster, but the accumulated suffering of children treated as disposable, allowed to harden into something that refuses to let the world move on.